Hello! Fantastic to be part of this celebration and reflection around costume and agency. Thank you, Christina, Sogia, and Sofia. I'm Donatella. I'm a costume scenographer and a co-creator of performance. I teach graduate students, I research and write about costume, and I also supervise PhDs at London College of Fashion. A shout out to graduates and research students from LCF who are also involved in costume agency, to Daphne Carstens, to Claire McGarrigle, and to Emily Nibrohin, whose work you can see in the costume agency exhibition, and in this conference to Bert Fortin, who is discussing her PhD research, as well as to colleague Michelle Danjou, who is presenting her research collaborations in dance. I was fortunate to also supervise a wonderful PhD. I very much look forward to our working group session and to discussing costume agency with Jocelyn McKinney. I hope that some of the exciting conversations we are having in these 3 days will find their way into our journal, Studies in Costume and Performance. Here are the covers of issues from the last 5 years. I edit this journal with Sofia Pantovaki and Sue Osmond, while Nadia Malik and Veronica Isaac are its reviews editors. I am delighted that we are discussing costume as having agency. Affirming this is fundamental in the building of discourse to which this journal is dedicated. Authors writing in the journal have been questioning underlying assumptions around costume, revealing a privileging of certain human agency over others through costume workings. We have also been nurturing through publishing creative engagements around performativity of matter that are essential in making performance. These studies invite us to consider costume anew, and the edition being planned around costume agency and critical costume 2020 will make a significant contribution to advancing both scholarship and practice. Costume is not just a goal in itself, but a way of contributing to end, even altering, understandings of performance and of the world. It is a constantly moving site of interactions that incites critical as well as physical engagements. Questioning of what we make, how it performs, its journey to the performance, its journey through the performance, its impact on the world and on those who come into contact with it are some of the questions that drive research. The practice that I'm going to discuss in the second half of this presentation starts from the idea of an empathy with material that refuses an a priori dominance of the human over the world, while also challenging established hierarchies of practice. I'm delighted that the exhibition of costume agency curated by Yuka Oyama includes moments from the 3 participatory research projects that I will discuss later. I focus first on the notion of agency and costume, reconsidering some well-known historical performances through their material performativity, not only to define what I mean by costume agency, but also to point out that such agency, be devoid of ethics, can be deployed for purposes of dominance and exploitation. This may be why, from certain perspective, to grant non-human entities such as costume agency remains a contested notion. Rebecca Schneider, for example, suggested in 2015 that concepts such as costume agency may absolve humans of their responsibilities, as agency is perceived as a human attribute. Andrew Sulfer labeled any non-human agency as an apolitical signifier, merely a synonym for energy. From this perspective, our claim that costume is agential could be considered unethical, diverting attention from a far more political framing of discourse. From a new materialist perspective, however, we can perceive costume as entanglements of human and non-human matter through which a tissue of ethicality runs, in Karen Barrett's terms, tracing an interdependence that extends to the material world at large. In this way, agency is not something that someone has, but is about what happens between, in what Karen Barrett's called agential interaction, which are mutual constitutions of entangled agency. Perhaps, therefore, in the case of costume, agencies are shared interactions engaging both humans and non-humans. A formulation of agency away from a purely human-centric definition challenges existing categories, hierarchies, and structural practice that have limited the possibility of what costume can be and do. The perception of costume as a passive object has also held scholarship back, subsuming it into other discourses that privilege certain types of human performance over others. For example, those of historically neglecting costume worker, a largely female workforce whose agency can still remain invisible in both critical reception of their work and scholarship. Critically, the agency of costume's affective materiality needs to be paid attention to, if only for the reason that it may be deployed to sustain and validate oppressive regimes and systems of privilege and control. An evocation of both the ethics and the shared agency of costumes finds several examples through history of this, but perhaps we can linger on just one. In Paris, in 1653, Louis XIV, in his performance as the mythological Greek god Apollo in the Ballet de la Nuit, led a retinue of dancing nobles through the performance. This was customary for monarchs from across all courts of Europe at the time, as you can see from these adjacent images. In his dance, he dominated the stage, enacting the sun bursting through the clouds of civil war, wearing Henry Guisy's costume. What is interesting in this case is that the nobility sharing the stage with him in the dance, being led by him in the dance, had recently been defeated at the end of a lengthy civil uprising against his absolutist rule. In this ballet, the aristocracy performed submission to a king who, following this costume performance, built the cult of the Sun King, le Roi de Soleil, beyond this costume as a way of entrenching his rule over the country. The agency of this costume was constructed through its performative materiality, a synthesis of Baroque sun rays, ancient myth, and Roman emperor skirted cuirass. It was encrusted with mirrors, stones, pearls, paillettes, metallic thread and fringing that came alive, refracting light in all directions, in the candle light of the triumphant all-night court ballet. Equally effective costumes were worn in courts across Europe. This surviving example is from Meleto Castle in Tuscany. Expert costume makers whose practice was shaped by their attunement to the performativity of the materials embroidered the flat gold thread with directional stitching that, similarly to the glittering fringing, amplified the costume performance of luminescence. This attunement to non-human materials is like the Henry Guisy costume worn by Louis XIV as a 15-year-old king in the Ballet de la Nuit that marked his royal performance well beyond the performance of his dominance over the court in 1650. From a different perspective, however, about 250 years later and still in Paris, an attunement to costume materiality enabled Loie Fuller to challenge, as a female performer living openly as a lesbian, the gender inequality of the turn of the century, boldly performing expressive fluidity and spatiality through huge costume. Dancing with billowing, cascading silk, she projected an expanded femaleness through affective performances. These impacted on multiple fields, propelling others to experiment with the performative relationship of non-human matter and human body. Martha Graham's Lamentations, 3 decades later, immersed her body into a contorted embodiment of grief through the performance of a tube of jersey that was rendered taut by her limbs pushing against it, as if the body was lacerating its own skin. In choreographing mourning and grief, Graham, like Fuller, found the means of expression through costume. Neither of their choreographies could have happened without its working, and its agency went beyond their performances. In Graham's case, though, this performance and its documentation situated her dance practice within the art gallery. So here costume agency is evident in the relationship between human and non-human matter, in how costume have marked bodies and impacted on the world. Whether reifying divine powers or claiming the stage and the art gallery, these costumes have altered somewhat the world through fleeting momentary performances and in ways that have outlasted their wearing. The specific situatedness of their coming into being, however, how those costumes made their journey to the stage, the interaction that may have given them shape, require a perspective that is immersed in the process of their making, something that we can only speculate about from an historian. Precede, inform, perform articulates a dependence on material performativity in order to foreground its agency. This is because the performativity of matter precedes costumes coming into being in ways that inform the impetus of its making, through interactions that give form to ways in which costume can then perform. This material agency places costume in a continuum of human non-human materiality, positing ecological priorities in an attunement to the performance of the world. The priority I wish to highlight through precede, inform and perform are that meaning is embedded in the process of the making of costume and of the performance. So for costume to be ethically agential, the gesture of its coming into being must take priority over the final products. This challenges established hierarchies and structures of costume practice, upending priorities and creating material-led horizontal cooperation and open-ended approaches. The aim of the documentation of these participatory co-creative processes is to mark moments that situate movement from within the performance of material. To observe how an effective material engagement may give impetus and shape to the performance, each of the three participatory events included lengthy preparation periods that engaged a group of co-creating costume artists well ahead of the events themselves. Each also included co-creators who were movement artists. All who opted into this process did so in the knowledge that together we were situating ourselves outside of standard practices. There were no designs to work towards, no required readings or independent tasks, and no extended group brainstormings, but rather physical and practical engagements around a range of disparate materials with which we established a creative dialogue that was situated between the cutting room table and the movement studio. The process that progressively developed formative wearable objects in an open-ended manner was also shaped by factors that included ecological priorities as well as storage and travel ahead of encounters with the event's participants. Working together over periods of months, we sourced the material through upcycling, using waste such as shredded waste paper, and repurposes existing objects, or sourcing non-petroleum textile and non-wovens. This archive of gestures was made in response to the behavior of materials that traveled from the initial human-non-human interactions to inform the individual and group improvisations of the participants. Imprints of the performativity of matter, the gesture that this invited was retained in my own physical memory, and this meant that materials, having been kept in storage, travelled between projects. For example, the aluminium wires that mark spaces and participants' bodies in moving drawing in 2008 were given a new bodily presence in material interactions in 2019 through a skin of wool gathered like a mad frill that escaped the body. Both are archived as gestures under the title of entanglements. And the frames with which movement artist Mary Kay Connolly is improvising in this image had been tension poles in its previous exhibit. The magnets that secured the paper folds to bodies in Wearing Space in 2015 were repurposed to hold colours together in material interactions in 2019 and are archived here as enfoldings. As colours unfolded, these transform into clouds and fill spaces and absorb the bodies within them. Enfoldings reshape materials into iterations of different folds, providing impetus for movement. Gesture archived in this project is bodyings in which weighty wearables and extension produce a doubling of the body and an accustomed otherness resulting from an emboldening of entangled gesture in seeking affective bulbousness and extended materiality. These three archived human, non-human gestures were selected as the evidence relational workings documented through photography. Physical warm-ups by Mary Kay Connolly in 2015 and 2019 and Marie Gabrielle Roti in 2018 were also devised in relation to the performative materialities of specific objects so that participants could attune to matter and channel perception through it while being immersed within it. Other human and non-human agential gesture, not included here, engaged other senses through touch or through the production of sound and smell. Sound in particular became a fundamental aspect of the relationship with the audience that attended the sharing in the Industrial Palace in Prague 2019 and was entirely generated by the materiality of the objects themselves. So to conclude, such relational breathing with, moving with and sounding with matter is ongoing. We practiced empathy and sympathy with material and with one another through materials, both in the participatory events and in the preparation stages that led to them. As such, this work applies an ethics of attunement to the world, which is foundational to further advancements of this research, and establishing democratic structures of co-creation that remain open to the world and to the infinite creative possibility that costume offers. The Costume Agency exhibition and the Critical Costume Conference have permitted a moment of archiving of fleeting gestures, creating categories and naming objects from the documentation of these events while articulating a way of working with costume that responds to ethical priority by embracing its agency so that it can alter understanding of our way of being in the world. I'm enormously grateful for all the fantastic participants and the generous co-creators and look forward to furthering this research for future participatory events. All we now need is for COVID-19 to go away so that we can all resume researches and practices that are dependent on human gatherings. Thank you so much for listening.